Green Worker Cooperatives is the name of our organization. The Co-op Academy is our Green Cooperative Business Boot Camp that we created. And it's something that we started in 2009, and we do it twice a year now. It lasts 5 months, and it's a really intensive program where people really get, the teams of people, and they operate in teams, are working together to start a business that they've come up with at least 3 people, and we support them with courses, the Saturday sessions and weeknights that are all about sales, marketing, finance, what it means to be a cooperative, how to work together without killing each other, how to make sure that you know about that one, how to make sure that your cooperative is truly green and is socially responsible, how to just create plans and follow through on them, and project planning, and all of those things we go through in a very popular pop ed style. I'm not a fan at all of lectures, even though I'm lecturing to you right now. But the approach that we use is very interactive, very hands-on. People creating, envisioning what they want, and then creating plans and following through on them. And that's really the whole approach of the Co-op Academy. You have 5 months to create a business. We approach people who say, they have a skill that they want to share with the participants in the Co-op Academy, and we say, okay, we don't want to lecture. So you got to come up. When we first started doing it in 2009, and then and really in last year, we completely revamped it and expanded it, and we reached out to people to create an expanded curriculum, and we said, don't give us a lecture. So you have to come up with something. And so we worked with a worker co-op called TESSA, the Toolbox for Education and Social Action. Anybody here ever heard of them? A few people? Great. Anybody ever heard of a board game called Coopoly? Yeah, so TESSA created Coopoly. It's a great board game. It will completely transform your relationship to Monopoly, the board game. And it's just a wonderful way to teach people about working together as a team and what a cooperative is. Because your journey around the board is not about creating monopoly capitalism and booting everybody else off the board, but it's about surviving as a cooperative, as a team, and then creating other cooperatives and really building a solidarity economy, building a cooperative economy. So we partnered with them to work with us in creating curriculum and going back and forth with some of our trainers, and to create something that we're really proud of. I consider democracy like any muscle. If you don't flex it, then it just withers away and you forget that it's there. Every now and then you get forced to exercise it, like when you have to make a compromise, come to make decisions with people, and it hurts. And that's when you want to kill people. And you want to run away. If you work you're an employee somewhere, you go to your boss so that they can fix it because you don't really want to fix it. But we turn it over to somebody else. And that somebody else, it's either our boss or it's our government, but we hand it over to somebody else. So if we actually create spaces, and I consider worker co-ops to be a space, if we create a space where people are actually in the practice of making decisions, then we really are creating a democratic society. So, for a worker in a workplace, it looks like a worker co-op. In schools, it looks like a democratic free school. There are lots of different venues and places where we can have democracy in practice. So for us, we view the Co-op Academy as our way of creating the training ground where people can actually flex that democratic muscle and work out the kinks for their business and figure out in that early stage how they're going to create this business together and do it amongst themselves without us saying, this is the blueprint, this is how you have to set up the business. It's your job to figure it out instead. And that's how people are really learning by doing. We're really excited about any kind of industry, any kind of business, and we take the approach that any business can be made green, with the exception of a few. We're not really supporting any weapons factories in the Bronx, or anywhere else for that matter. But for the most part, we look at the green in a green business as being a full breakdown of the operations of the business. And that's actually an exercise that we turn over in the Co-op Academy to the participants. So we have them analyze all of the operations of their business and figure out where are you using the earth, where are you using the earth, water, wind, air, whatever. Where are you using the earth, what we consider to be resources, and where are you creating waste? And then we work with them to figure out what are the ways to nip that in the bud and not create waste. So those are things that's an approach that we take. So we feel any business can be green for the most part as long as you're not taking life.
Over the course of Power's history, we've been relatively successful in developing sort of a core group of working class leaders, mostly immigrant Latinas and African American members. But one of the things that I think we've tried to really emphasize, and I think it builds on one of the points that Omar was making, is that education doesn't just happen through trainings and discussions, but it also happens through decision making and action. And so not only is the political education happening in the context of the organization through Power University and the various trainings that we wind up offering, but it's also taking place through the one-on-ones with other leaders, with organizers. It's happening in the evaluations after we wind up doing an action. It's happening in all of the ways that we wind up interacting with folks through the organization's experience. And I think for us, it's really translated into a different type of practice. There was a particular moment, the organization started in 1997, the membership was largely African American and low-income white folks. And after about 4 years, we'd begun organizing immigrant Latinas into the organization. And at first, there was sort of like a little détente between the African Americans and the Latinas. And then over time, there were sort of negative comments that were coming out from one group towards the other. And the staff and some of the leadership would intervene by checking people, telling people it was an inappropriate thing to say. We would have one-on-ones with them, and it would sort of quell the situation for a while. It didn't really sort of establish political unity. But instead, the members, I think, just didn't want to sit down and get scolded by me. But ultimately, that wasn't sufficient to sort of build, I think, strong solidarity in the organization. And again, sort of some of the comments came up. And so ultimately, the organization decided to go through an extensive political education discussion to talk about whether or not Power should remain a multiracial organization or whether it should ultimately break apart into separate sort of racially based organizations. So we had a discussion with the leadership, which is composed entirely of the members of the organization. And we all agreed that the leaders would participate in a compulsory 10-week-long political education discussion. And it was also open to all of the rest of the members. So the first week of the sessions, we wound up breaking people into their specific racial groups and had folks identify what the major problems were in their particular communities. And when they were done with that, they came back together again and then wound up reporting back what it is that they had come up with. We concluded the session by saying that the rest of this process, we're going to look at the histories of each of the communities, and then we'll be making a decision about whether or not the organization is going to remain a multiracial organization or split apart. And it was interesting because during the next week, members were coming into the office and being like, "You're not really going to let us vote about splitting the organization apart, right?" We're like, "Yeah, this is your organization. You get to make that decision." And you could tell people were sort of incredulous that they were actually going to have an opportunity to sort of make a decision about the future of the organization. For the next 4 weeks, we looked at the history of African Americans in the United States, starting off with the transatlantic slave trade, going into the Civil War. We actually wound up looking at the fact that during the build-up to the Civil War, the United States, a lot of people in the room probably know, we actually discovered through this process, the United States had serious conversations about annexing Latin America and actually took over Nicaragua for a while, imposed a US-born person as the president in an attempt to then have Latin America be the substitute slave states, while the rest of the westward expansion took place with free states. So we wound up talking about that. We looked at Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and then the contemporary state of African Americans in the United States. So we finished those 4 weeks, and then we wound up looking at the history of the United States' relationship to Latin America. And we talked again about Manifest Destiny and the taking of Mexican land into the United States. We wound up looking at the history of US military intervention in Latin America. And what was interesting in both of those sections, I think, is that you could see the consciousness of the respective groupings shifting. Where originally the Latinas thought of the African Americans as just another immigrant group. But they spoke English and they had papers, so they didn't understand what the big deal was. And then for a lot of the African Americans, they saw, sort of one generation removed, all of the successes that had come out of the civil rights movement. And then they saw this influx of Latinos and Latinas into cities across the United States and saw them as sort of an invading horde trying to take the resources that their parents, their grandparents had struggled for. And you could see their consciousness shifting in terms of their orientation. So then the final session, we wound up talking about, okay, we brought back the problems that people had named, whether it was unemployment or underemployment, whether it was incarceration or ICE raids. And we said, okay, so look, it seems like the problems are actually pretty different. What do people think we should do then in terms of the organization's future? People said, well, look, the problems on their face may be somewhat different, but we have to understand that the history of the roots of these problems are identical. And so, yeah, when we see each other in the communities, like we have different experiences, we talk about our experiences differently, but ultimately we have this, we're dealing with the root cause of our problems are similar, and we then need to be in united struggle with one another. And so through that, the members actually decided, and the staff was sort of, we were a little shocked that it went as smoothly as it did. And so we actually wound up sort of advocating a little bit, like, you know, but it would be easier if we were sort of to break up into separate organizations. So the leadership ultimately wound up voting unanimously to stay a multiracial organization. And they decided to have an 11th meeting where ultimately they talked about what does it mean then for us to be a multiracial organization. So the Latinas started talking about, well, the immigrant rights movement needs to not only be talking about legalization for people who have migrated to the United States, but we also need to be talking about legalization for people in the prison industrial complex, right? The African Americans started talking about the importance of language rights and recognizing that our language had been stolen from us and that the English only and sort of you need to learn English to be in the United States is another sort of episode of that same story. And so then a lot of the African Americans became staunch language rights advocates through this process. I think from our experience, this work of doing political education and seeing that as being just as critical as the fights for workers' rights and the fights against welfare cuts ultimately begins to position us to have a movement that is led by the people who are most directly affected, but not just as token representatives who are able to share stories of displacement and oppression and exploitation, but people who are positioned and strengthened to be able to offer strategic, analytic, tactical, and practical leadership to a multi-sectoral movement.
What kind of financial support or childcare support or supplementary income or grant do you supply or have worked out for people between when they start and when they're actually profitable?
We're not in the financial position to offer any kind of support like that. I'm not sure that we would, even if we did, even if we were in a financial position to do that. And I'm not a big fan of programs that do offer that. I think that there are issues there, certainly. I mean, within the Co-op Academy, we do where possible, we create support mechanisms so that people can go through the Co-op Academy, because at that stage they're doing that groundwork, that base work. They're not actually engaged in the development of the business or pushing for sales. So we do offer childcare when people need childcare. And we do charge a fee for the Co-op Academy. So, we charge $550 per person, but we set it up per member of the team. But we actually require that the team fundraise for the money so that they go out and crowdfund and they do crowdsource the money so that it's not coming out of their pocket, and at the same time it's creating a buzz around their future business, around their future co-op. So we do things like that. But I'm also of the view that starting up a business is hard. And starting up a co-op, it's like, and it's still going to be like any other business. And there's going to have to be sacrifices that are made there. And if you're launching a co-op, you have the benefit of having a team of people that can support you in that. And so I think the trick then, working within the resources that we have, is how can you create a team of people to support you to actually launch that business. So I'll give you an example. My wife just went through the Co-op Academy, and so she and two other partners, they created a cooperative called Ginger Moon, which provides they cook and deliver healthy, nutritious meals for new moms. And they make really great food, so any new mothers out here, you can find them Ginger Moon. But they there are three of them. Two of them just gave birth, and my wife included, within the past few months. So we just had a baby 10 days ago. Thank you. And thank you. And one of our other partners just had a baby like 2 months ago. And so the 2 out of 3 of them are out of commission, but they're still a part of the co-op. But they had made a choice. Okay, during this period, the next few months, they were going to lay low. They were going to, build some groundwork, and then going forward, they were going to do work in a way that allows them to really spend time with their children, but still move forward as a business. So for them, that looks like bringing on another member who can take care of the kids, when they have to cook, and somebody who has that strength. So that's an approach that they can take. I think when you're talking about a cooperative and a team effort, then you got to build a team in there, and really create the spaces for people to support each other.
I think the story that you told about the tensions between African American and Latina members was really insightful for like how an organization can approach conflict within a member-led or sort of democratically based model, but also I'm curious sort of the role that staff had in that, and whether or not it really would have turned out to be that, would it really have been an option really for the organization to split, knowing I'm sure that the staff were very involved in like how to structure that process and guide the members through that process. So I'm just curious if you have reflections or learnings about that within really engaging in leadership development in a genuine way.
From the standpoint of any organization, it's important to try to find allies. And so in the process of Power deciding whether or not it was going to remain a multiracial organization, there was really one member, this Latina Nora Calderon, who knows, but she just had this sort of strong commitment to multiracial solidarity. And so the staff worked really closely with her in trying to think about, well, what's going to be effective? How do we frame this discussion? I think for us, the litmus test about whether or not it was successful was ultimately the level of genuine solidarity that existed. And you could do a very stark contrast from before we did that process to after. And it didn't mean that we had been able to substantially change the political views that existed in the broader community. But what happened was that through that process, we had a team of now 35 people who, when somebody came into the organization and said a backwards thing, it wasn't any longer the staff that had to sort of jump on it, but it was instead sort of much more organically coming out of the membership. So for us, that was sort of the telltale sign that we had actually been able to shift the sort of genuine unity in the organization, particularly amongst the leadership.
I want to thank all of you for coming out here tonight. I also want to remind you and hope that we will see you next month, May 28th. We will have an event called Agitating for Better Public Schools, and we'll have representatives from the New York Collective of Radical Educators together with folks from the Coalition for Public Education. And finally, I want to have all of you join me in giving a big round of applause for